What we're going to talk about with objects today may seem a bit redundant in a lot of ways, and for that I apologize. But it is good level setting, and hopefully it would also make it a lot easier and a lot faster for us to kind of go through the material, so we have more time to work on the workshops and hopefully address any concerns you may have there. Okay, so what is an object? The technical definition is that an object is an unordered collection of key value pairs. So it is a data type in JavaScript, and later on we will see that just like numbers, strings, booleans, arrays, etc., objects have their own class in JavaScript. But this idea of key value pairs is something that's actually incredibly important to us. In Python, objects are not called objects; they're called something called dictionaries. So DICTS. You might see it also referred to as dictionaries instead. And the reason why I really like that analogy is when I say key value pairs, it may be a bit confusing what I'm referring to. But in the same way that we call something a key value pair, it's the same way that we would call something in a dictionary a word definition pair. So in that analogy, the key really is the word, and the value is the definition. And so very similar to how we use a dictionary to look up words to get their definitions, in JavaScript for objects, we look up keys to get their values. Now, we already have some experience with this idea of looking up a key to get its value when we used arrays, except we didn't call them keys, we called them indexes or positions, right? So one way to think about it is when I say give me the first element in an array, what I'm really saying is I'm sorry, what I'm really saying is give me the value that's aligned with the first key in the array. Now, one big difference between an array and an object is an array has something called order, right? There is a first element, a second element, a last element, etc. In an object, if you notice how we called it an unordered collection, that just means in an object there is no order. There is no first key value pair or last key value pair. Everything more or less exists in the same level. And so whenever we need to get a particular value, the only way really for us to do it is by accessing the key associated with that value. So here's a really quick example of an array and also an object. If I want to access the first element in the array, I just do array, I use bracket notation, I put in index 0. However, if I want to access value 1 in the object, I still use our old bracket notation, but now instead of putting a numerical position inside the brackets, I put in the key as a string. In this case, the key is the string KEY1, and so when I put it in there, in both cases, when I print out the values, I get back value 1 as my output. Okay, so very similar to arrays, except instead of using positions, we now use the keys. But in both cases, we get back the values associated with that position or with that key. One of the main reasons why we use objects is just because they're a lot more useful, because they give us a lot more details around what we're looking for. So on line 2 there, I have an object called Pusheen, right? It's an array and it has 3 pieces of information, Pusheen, 7, and gray and tabby. I have the information, but it's actually really hard for me to kind of know what those data points correspond to, right? What is Pusheen? What is 7? What is gray and tabby? So an array is a good way to hold a lot of value, a lot of values, but what it's not good at is giving me context for what those values represent. Here's where an object comes in a lot more handily, right? So with an object, if I have 3 key value pairs, I am still also holding 3 pieces of information, so Pusheen, 7, and gray and tabby. But now, in addition, I am also holding the name, age, and color stored as keys. So if we were to break down the anatomy, if you will, of the object, notice how the object on line 10 there starts with the open curly brace and ends with a closing curly brace on line 14. So that demarcates the beginning and end of the object. Each key value pair in an object is separated by a colon. So on line 11 there, when you see name, colon, Pusheen, that means name is a key and Pusheen is a value. And then lastly, at the end of the line, we have a comma, which separates each key value pair line over line, right? So Pusheen, so name Pusheen is one key value pair, comma, age 7 is another key value pair, comma, color, gray and colon, gray and tabby is a third key value pair. Also, this is a very hard and fast rule about objects in JavaScript, is that the keys have to be strings. Okay, so here name, age, and color are all strings, which means we can use it as keys in JavaScript. Cool. So something that we've already seen quite a few times, which is that if we use type of an object, we get back object. Pretty straightforward. And so once again, we go back to this idea of creating an object, right? So if I was to ask you to create an object from scratch, the first thing that we would need to start with is our open and also close curly brace to know where object starts and ends. We see our colon and we see the comma at the end of line 7 and line 8 separating each key value pair. But one difference here now, notice is how for the keys name, age, and color, they no longer have quotes around them. And the reason for that is because, like I said before, in JavaScript, the keys in an object have to be strings, right? They cannot be numbers, they cannot be objects or arrays or anything else for that matter. They have to be strings, right? And so what that means is that because that is such a hard and fast rule, when we write the keys for objects, we actually don't even need to put them in quotes, because what JavaScript's going to do is JavaScript's going to take whatever you input as a key and it's going to convert it into a string on your behalf. Okay, and so all that means is here is that when I write on line 7, when I write in name, what JavaScript's going to do is JavaScript is going to say, oh, your key is name. Well, I don't care what it was. It could be a variable, it could be anything you want. I'm going to convert it into a string and then store that string for you as the key. And so because JavaScript objects, really enforces that rule that all keys have to be strings, when we write keys in JavaScript, very often you'll see us not even use the quotes. Now, you could use the quotes, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, more typing than you probably need to. And we all know how much developers hate having to type unnecessary characters. Okay. One more point of distinction here is that, remember, the keys have to be strings. The values can be whatever you want, right? So if I look at age, the age key is a string, AGE, but the value is a number, right? And so the value can be whatever you want, but once again, the keys have to be strings. Accessing a value is pretty straightforward. We access it in the same way that that we saw earlier, that we did with arrays with bracket notation. And so one way for us to access a given key is just to pass in the string of the key into the bracket. So we have name, age, and color. And just like within arrays, if I try to access an index that doesn't exist in an array, I don't get an error, I get back undefined. Similarly here, notice how on line 14, when I try to access a key that's not in the object, I don't get back an error, I get back undefined. And so this is something that you should just be aware of, is something that happens in JavaScript, is that we don't give back errors, we give back undefined when we try to use a key that doesn't exist in the object. Okay, so one more thing to note here, and this is, I guess, more has to do with JavaScript than it has to do with necessarily objects, right? But notice how on line 10, I have a variable called key to check, and I set that equal to the string name. Now, when I pass in key to check into line 12, on line 12, into the pushing and in between the brackets, notice how I'm not putting quotes around key to check because I want to use key to check as the variable. And what the variable evaluates to is a string name, N-A-M-E. And so here, when I do pushing index key to check, what I'm really saying is pushing index name, right, or key name, N-A-M-E. And so I can use a variety of operations in between the brackets, but the most important thing is that whatever in between the brackets has to evaluate into a string, and that string has to be a key in the object. And so for key to check, we get back the name, the value associated with the name key, and on line 13, we get back the value associated with the color key. And then one more thing here that sometimes trips people up is, and you might see pretty commonly as well, is we can always use bracket notation for things. Another common practice is to something called dot notation. Dot notation works very similar to bracket notation, except the only difference is, and it's a pretty big difference actually, is that one of the benefits of using dot notation is that I don't need to put in quotes around the key name. I can just do pushing dot name to access the name key. But notice how that also creates some issues for me, right? Because what that also means is I am not able to use variables when I use dot notation, right? So if I do pushing dot name, I am literally looking for the NAME name key. If I do pushing dot age or dot color, I am literally looking for the dot age or dot color key. However, on line 14, when I do pushing dot key to check, we might say, well, key to check on line 9 is created as a variable, which your value is to name, so actually pushing.name, right? But once again, very important, keep in mind when we use dot notation, it does not translate to another variable value, right? It is what it is. And so on line 14 there, when I do pushing.key to check, what I'm literally looking for is a key inside the pushing object called key to check, Keytocheck. And so if I get .name, .agent, .color, I get back the right values. But on line 14, when I do .key to check, well, the Keytocheck, the key to check key, does not exist inside pushing, and so I still get back undefined. I'm going to stop here. I know this might have been a little fast, but are there any questions? Or does everyone feel really good about this so far?
David?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a little quick, sorry. So can you kindly just repeat the difference between just key to check as a variable and then
Hello?
the parens machine.key to check?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah, so the main difference is when I use bracket notation, like I did here, line 12 there, right? What bracket notation does is give me something within the brackets, and I will evaluate it first and then use it, right? And so here, when I put key to check inside the brackets, it's a variable, right? The bracket notation recognizes that key to check is a variable, so it tries to figure out what that value is, and that value represents the name string, right? Because we define it on line 10. So in that case, by the time line 12 finishes evaluating, we are looking at pushing and we're looking for the name key. Does that make sense?
Right. So what will it return? It will return pushing.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. But if I look on the next page when I use dot notation, right? Dot notation once again is something that's meant to be a shortcut, and so there's a trade-off, right? The benefit of the shortcut is that you don't have to type in the quotes anymore. But the downside to that shortcut is that you actually can no longer use variables with dot notation. So whatever comes after the dot has to be the exact name of the key. And so the point we're trying to draw here is just that on line 14 now, when I do pushing.key to check is no longer a variable. It has to be the name of the key that we're looking for. And so when I look inside the pushing object between lines 3 and 7, because there is no key called Keytocheck, that's going to return for us undefined. And so if you're ever having trouble with dot notation, I actually suggest, especially if you're not comfortable with objects yet, just use bracket notation, because bracket notation can handle both variables and strings. So it's super flexible and will work in every scenario. Dot notation is a shortcut, but it only works in instances in which you don't have variables. Does that clear up the question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions? Okay, someone sent me a message, so I'm gonna look at it. So yeah, so hopefully everyone can see my screen, but Arjun just asked, can I do console.log pushing.col plus or? And the answer is no. I believe what that does is that's going to evaluate pushing.col, which is not what we're trying to get at. And I don't even know if .col is actually valid JavaScript. That actually might throw an error as well. We can actually very quickly test that out. So if I have something called, let x equal, this object here, and I'll put in foo and I'll put in bar. If I do, if I do x.foo, for example, when I print it out, I get back bar. That's pretty straightforward. But if I do x.foo, okay, yeah, so I can't even put a quote after the dot, right? Whatever comes after a dot has to be the exact name, has to be the exact string of the key. Cool. Any other questions?
On one of the previous slides, it was line 13, where it has like in quotations COL plus in quotations OR.
Yep.
Does that evaluate? It returns gray and tabby because it combines the two strings before it evaluates what the rest of it's asking, like is being done.
Right, because that uses bracket notation. So bracket notation is a container, right? And so whatever's inside the container is evaluated first, and then it takes into account kind of what the bracket is.
Oh,
Dot notation doesn't give you the benefit of evaluating anything. It just renders that string as is.
right. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, great. Any other questions? Cool. All right then. Just moving on. So that's dot notation. And once again, if you find dot notation to be very tricky, the short answer is just don't use it. Bracket notation will work in all scenarios. And so if you're first starting off, like that's by far the easiest way to make sure you don't kind of get caught in any particular issues with dot notation. And once you get more comfortable with objects, dot notation may be just kind of a better shortcut to use. Okay. So adding a key value pair, once again, incredibly straightforward. We can use it with either bracket notation or dot notation. We just need to do pushing dot or pushing bracket, whatever, and we use our equal sign, the assignment operator, and whatever's to the right hand side of the equal sign will get assigned as a value, right? And so the way that we create or assign values and for objects is almost identical to the way we do it for arrays, right? So this is just how we add a key value pair. And then if I want to change a value, it is honestly the same exact thing, right? So on line 9 there, I used bracket notation. On line 10, I used dot notation. But we still go back and use our handy equal sign or assignment operator. Or in the cases of numbers on line 10, we use our increment operator to edit numbers, right? So in every scenario, all we're really doing is saying, hey, this key, set your value to this, and whatever this new value is will overwrite the old value completely. Deleting a key value pair is something that you are able to do, and we do it with a delete keyword. So here when I do delete pushing, with age, this will delete those particular key value pairs from the objects. I will say that deleting a key value pair is not something that happens very commonly in JavaScript. In the vast majority of cases, all that really happens when we have an object with excessive key value pairs is we just don't use it, right? It's almost like you wouldn't go to a dictionary and delete all the words you don't use. Generally speaking, with an object, if we have a key value pair that we don't need, we just don't use it. And so deleting an object in the key value pair in an object is actually not very common. The most direct way that I know that people use it to delete key value pairs is for security reasons, right? So if I have someone's user information as an object that contains maybe their email and their password, and before I hand off that object, I want to delete those sensitive pieces of information, that will be probably one very clear scenario in which it makes sense to delete key value pairs. But unless I'm trying to hide that information or if I'm trying to not share it with anyone else, delete is really not used very commonly. Okay, two more. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Previous slide, you were console log and then the object's name machine that give you both the key and the value pair.
Yep.
Okay. So if you did not delete anything, it would then give you every single one of those key values, the name, age, and color. If you did not delete anything, right?
Yeah, it will give me this.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yep. Cool. Any other questions before we move on to the last two things on the in operator? So adding a value, changing a value, deleting a value, etc.
Can you delete just a value instead of a key and value?
Yeah, so deleting a value is the same as replacing the value with whatever it is you want to replace it with. So if you want to delete it and make it undefined, you're just replacing the value with undefined.
Thanks.
Yep. That makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
So you just literally just like replace it with value undefined.
Yeah, if you want. If by deleting it you want to make it 0, then you just replace it with 0, right? Like deleting a value but keeping the key is the same as replacing the value. When we talk about deleting a key value pair, it means by definition removing both the key and the value.
would you use the like delete command then, or just kind of just write it? Yeah. Would you not? It sounds like you wouldn't use the delete command there if you just want to make it defined. You do like machine age equals undefined.
Right. Delete by definition deletes both the key and the value. So if you want to keep the key in there and with another value, then you would just be replacing a value. You wouldn't be deleting anything.
Cool. Thanks.
Yep. Cool. Any other questions? All right then. Cool. So the last two things we'll talk about are ways to loop through objects. So the first one is pretty straightforward. The second one is a bit more involved. The first thing we'll talk about is the in operator. It's once again a reserved word in JavaScript, and its functionality is extremely simple. All it does is it takes in the name of a key in, and then we put in the object, and all the in operator does is returns a boolean. It returns back true or false. If we give it a key in an object, its job is to tell us, does that key exist in that object? It looks for an exact match. So if I look for AME in pushing, I would get back false, because even though the string name contains AME, name and AME are not exactly equal, so that'll give me back false. But all the in operator does is if I do the key I'm searching for in the object I'm searching within, it will just give me back a true or false to determine whether or not that key exists in that object. So that's pretty straightforward. What's more involved is when we actually start using it, especially in the context of a for loop. Of a for in loop. So with an array, it's easy for us to loop through or search through every single value in an array, because we can use the indexes as a way to iterate through every single position or every single index in the array. However, for a for loop, for a object, it's a little more difficult, right? Because as I mentioned in the very first slide, there's no order, there's no starting point. We just kind of start somewhere and we end somewhere. And so how do I go through all the keys in an object? Well, the for loop lets us actually do that, right? So here on line 9, if using Vicky, which is the previous student's name, as a variable, for example, right? Here on line 9, if I do for, right, and then open and close parentheses, and I say let Vicky, in this case, in Pusheen. Let, remember, is a reserved word. All that does is creates a variable. In this case, Vicky is a variable that I'm creating, and I can rename that anything I want. So I can actually, in this case, I'll just say I'll rename this to Frank, who's the name of our fellow today. Oh. Okay, so this is just a variable name. In is our operator, and then Pusheen is the object that we're searching in, right? And so what this for loop will do is it will actually let us go through, and it will go through and give us back every single key value pair in the object, and each iteration of it will be a different key value pair, and it will run this as many times as it needs to until it goes through every single key value pair. And so that's a little bit complicated. So let's take a look at what this is actually doing, right? Here, what we're doing is we're console logging out Pusheen's, in this case, variable Frank is Pusheen index Frank. Okay. In this case, Pusheen has 3 key value pairs, and so when I run this for and loop, this body is going to run 3 times. The first time, Frank is going to be one of the keys, and if I have an object and I have the key, then I can also have I am also able to access a value, so I'm able to access Pusheen index Frank. And I can do this 3 times over, right? And so basically what the for and loop does is that it doesn't let you control the order in which you access every single key value pair, but it does allow you to access every single key value pair, or really every single key at one juncture, at a point in the loop. And so here, when I have this for loop on line 9, what I'm really saying is whatever's in the body of my code here, in this case line 10, do that line of code for every single key in the Pusheen object. And each time I do it, in this case a variable Frank will assume a different key. And so that's why when I run this, I get back Pusheen's name is Pusheen, Pusheen's age is 7, Pusheen's color is gray and tabby. Okay, so it is a way for us to go through every single key value pair in the object, But unlike the way we do it with for loops and arrays, notice how this doesn't let you skip certain keys, right? And so this brings up a very kind of prominent aspect of for and loops, which is that you only want to use for and loops when you want to go through every single key value pair in the object, right? For and loop doesn't let you customize, it doesn't let you skip. It just pretty much says, I will go through every single key value pair in your object once and only once. And so here, if I was to say, for let key in Pusheen.
Can you talk about why you chose to use? Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, can you talk about why you chose to use a variable called frank as the key there?
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know that you can use any variable you want there. Let is a reserved word. In is a reserved word. Pusheen is an important word because that's the name of the object. In that case, I just use frank. I can use any variable I want to let you know that that's the part where you're naming a variable that will be used later on in the loop. So you can name that whatever you want.
In the slides that I had printed out, they used the word key, which I guess you were trying to make a point that key is arbitrary.
Yeah, key is completely arbitrary naming. Yep.
So, but you are assigning key to mean something in that moment when you put it in the loop.
Well, so
you're assigning frank to mean the key for a key value pair.
Yeah.
And that's what that parenthetical statement does.
Right. So how when you use a for loop to iterate through the array, usually you said let I equal 0, but it doesn't have to be I. It could be anything you want.
I see.
Right. So it's the same idea here. I just wanted to kind of.
So you could be I.
It could be anything you want. In this case, I'm just trying to say that it doesn't have to be key. There's nothing that ties in the variable key to the key. We could call that variable whatever we want, and it still represents the same thing.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yep. So here's another example of us using a for and loop, except the only difference here is on line 10. If you notice on the very last line, I'm not using Pusheen index. Or I'm not using bracket notation there. I'm using dot key, and so what that's going to happen is when I do that, my key, I'm still going to run this. The for loop is still going to run this function 3 times, or it's still going to run this body of code in line 10 3 times. Each time, it's still going to access the key, which is going to be in this case name, age, and then color, right? Because key just happens to be the name of the variable that I used. But remember what we talked about with the restrictions for dot notation, right? With dot notation, we can't use variables, and so when I do Pusheen dot key, it means I'm literally looking for a key called key inside the Pusheen object, and because that key doesn't exist, in this case I get back undefined as a value for all three key values. Right. So once again, just to be careful when you're using dot notation versus bracket notation, dot notation does not allow you to use variable values. Okay. One other thing just to be aware of, and this is a nice tool to use, but it's also not something you should be relying on too often. Is just that in any cases, if you do want to get all of the keys in an object as an array, the object class does have a function called object.keys, and all you got to do is pass in the name of the object, and what it'll do is it will return for you the name, or sorry, it will return for you an array with each of the individual keys as a string element. Here in the printout, we didn't include the quotes, but just know that there are quotes around the keys, right? So for the Pusheen object, if I was to call object.keys and I pass in the Pusheen object, I will get back an array with 3 elements, the strings name, age, and color. And last but not least, before we've talked about this idea of nested arrays, in which case I have arrays that can hold in other arrays. Right, so this should look somewhat familiar. Well, the same thing applies for objects. I can also have nested objects, right? So I can have objects in which the values are other objects. And just like how with nested arrays, I'm able to chain together multiple bracket notations. Here, I'm also able to chain together access into nested objects by doing multiple either dot notations, or there I could also use multiple bracket notations as well, right? So here on line 13, for example, I'm doing Pusheen dot siblings, which gives me the value of the siblings key, which in this case is another object. And when I do dot sister, that gives me back the value associated with the sister key inside that inner object, which in this case is Stormy and then pip. Okay, so here I use dot notation twice to navigate the nested object. I could very easily also use bracket notation too. There's no difference between the two.
And that format would be like bracket, two sets of square brackets.
Yeah, so that would be something that looks like this.
Cool.
Yeah, same. Yeah, it works the exact same. Like lines 13 and 14 are doing, other than looking for brother and sister, they're doing the same exact thing.
Quick question.
Yep.
So is the for in loop specifically used with objects?
Yes. Cool. And pretty much that's all I have for today, right? So we talked about the basics of an object, how it writes it, how do we use it. We talked about adding, changing, replacing values in it. We also talked about the in operator, but usually in context of a for in loop, which allows you to go through every single key in an object. And then lastly, we talked about how object.keys gives you back an array of all the keys, and just that nested objects, both in terms of creation and also in terms of access, works almost identically to what we've seen so far for nested arrays as well, in terms of how we can chain together either the dot notations or the or for objects in this case the bracket notations. So, any questions?
Can you show us how we could use object keys in for in loop?
How can we use object keys in a for in loop? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. I mean, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, a for in loop isn't, so object.keys is like a function that just gives you back an array of keys. It's not really meant to be used with a for in loop. Like object.keys gives you back an independent array of the keys. A for in loop just helps you navigate and traverse through the object, so they're somewhat unrelated in that vein.
I guess to tag on there, is there any way to use a for in loop and not go through every single key value pair? To go through specific key value pairs, I guess?
Yeah, not really. So a for in loop will always go through every single key value pair. Within the body of your code, you can have an if-else statement that skips certain keys, but that just means, you know, like you're manually telling it to skip it, not that you're actually skipping it with a loop. So the if statement will probably be your best way to kind of do a filter, but once again, like it's a filter you add on. It doesn't come built into the for in loop.
Hey, David, in a previous lecture, we talked about arrays as being objects as well.
Yep.
Minutes, but like, how are arrays objects?
Arrays are objects because when you dig down really deep into like kind of the JavaScript source code, what you'll notice is that arrays are actually just objects, but we've built another kind of different class, a different set of, I guess, architecture around it, right? They're like super kind of, you know, like what's the analogy here? Like a truck is just a car, right? But like we use trucks and we see trucks and we kind of, you know, see them very differently, but fundamentally they are just a car.
Okay, I wouldn't see it from what you covered tonight, right? Because I just couldn't make the connection, but it's underneath the hood.
Yeah, it's not something that we will ever need to like fundamentally understand in bootcamp prep. And honestly, I would say that most developers don't even like understand it. Like you just kind of take it for granted that this is a feature of JavaScript.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
I thought I missed it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's definitely much more of a lower level like core language thing. Cool. Are there any other questions before I break us up for the workshop? All right. All right, seeing that, I will break us up for the workshop, and then we will be underway. I see a lot of folks only came for a lot of people only came for the lecture.